Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band podcast. I'm your host, Benedictine. If you are new to the show, welcome. Thank you for joining us. If you are already a listener, welcome back. Glad you're joining us again. And if you got any value out of these past episodes that you've been listening to, please go to Apple Podcast or your podcast app of choice and leave us a review there. This would really help us discover more, or help other people discover us and help us reach more people just like you and help them make better records on their own at their jam space, at your home studio. So please go to Apple Podcasts, leave us a 5-star review there and a couple of nice sentences about the show. Very much appreciated. If you want some personal feedback and guidance for your next project, if you have questions, if you're confused about the whole process, you don't know where to start, you need a step-by-step plan, basically, please go to theselfrecordingband.com/call and book a free first one-on-one call with me so I can give you a step-by-step plan. I can listen to you where you are right now. I can listen to your songs, give you feedback. You can tell me where you want to go, and then we'll see if I can help you get there. At the very least, you'll get a step-by-step roadmap that you can take and implement on your own or together with me. I can't wait to talk about your music, so go to theselfrecordingband.com/call. Today, as always, I'm not here alone, but I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm Owen Flood. Hello, Malcolm. How are you?
Hey, Benny. I'm great, man. How are you?
I'm great, too. Thank you. Had a great weekend. I'm still kind of not really back into work mode, it seems, or at least my brain is not. I'm having trouble finding words. But but yeah, I had a great weekend. And I'm actually refreshed, and I had a good day already behind me. But for some reason, my brain is not really into it yet.
Yep. I can feel that. I'm still on my coffee this morning, so I'm with you. It is, I think, episode 145 this episode.
It is.
And we got to figure out what we're going to do for the big 150, man. It's a big deal.
It's a big deal, for sure.
Brainstorming on that. And audience, if you have any ideas, go to the Self-Recording Band community on Facebook and let us know what you think we should do. Should I fly to Germany? Should I do it?
I would very much appreciate that. But
it's probably going to be that's going to land on Christmas, so it'd be a little weird.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe not the best time to do this. But what could we do? I mean, we talked about it before the show, Malcolm. We could maybe do some sort of community event again. We did that for our 100th episode, and maybe we should do that. Maybe we can do a live thing, invite the community. We'll let you know.
Yeah, that was a really fun time.
Yeah, we'll let you know. Something like that.
Yeah, if you have ideas, do go to the Facebook community and let us know.
Yes, the selfrecordingband.com/community, or just search the Self-Recording Band community on Facebook and join us there. And let us know if you have any ideas. Yeah, totally right, Malcolm. All right, today's episode is actually also inspired from a question from the community. We started last week with part 1 of this episode, and it is about building arrangements with the mix in mind. The question came from Jesse Crawford, from a band called Loma Roses, or an artist project. I'm not sure if it's a band or if it's his project. I think there are at least 2 people, the way I saw it, right? Loma Roses, Jesse Crawford. He posted a question, and the question was, I was wondering if you would have input about arrangement concepts, specifically about how to produce your songs to where the instruments /tones can be clearly defined from one another. I'm interested in hearing how other people approach this idea. To me, one of the main challenges is making tones that play well together. So last time we talked about that, and we started with a general big picture part of that conversation, and then we talked about drums and bass, about rhythm tracks, how they go together, things you need to watch out for, how to make bass and kick drum work when it comes to arrangements, how to make sure that the rhythm guitars and the bass and the drums build sort of this rhythm section that works. We talked about it from the perspective of frequency content and how you make space for each source tone, basically. And these are not mixing decisions, by the way. This is arrangement decisions, which instrument do you include in your arrangement and how do they go together with their natural source tones, basically. And then we looked at it from a performance perspective, where we were talking about how strumming patterns, timing, what you actually play, how that goes together and creates this arrangement. Similar, if you put everything together, it's similar to, conducting an orchestra or something, where all the instruments, you have to work with what is there in the room, and all the instruments and what they play have to work together, and you can't do a lot after the fact, or nothing after the fact, basically. And this is the way we think about arranging too. And if you do that properly, then in post, in mixing, you can do much more with less artifacts and problems. You have the freedom you can do things without getting into trouble, basically. You don't have to fix as much, and you can make good creative decisions, and your life will be so much easier in the mix. Long story short, this is part 2 of it. And this time we are talking about how to arrange lead parts, which means lead melodies, guitars, synth, whatever, and also lead vocals, backing vocals, and maybe additional production stuff. So we finished the rhythm section. Now we go to the melody parts, basically.
Yeah, so I guess like melody, that could include, vocals, that could be lead guitar lines, melodic synths, pretty much anything that you're going to hum along to. That's what I consider a lead part.
Absolutely. And before we have to repeat all of that, if you haven't watched or listened to the last episode, please just go back and do that before you start this one, I think, because the first part of that also applies to this episode. And way we don't have to say the same thing again.
Mandatory listening, I think, in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to go through the bullet points really quickly so you know why you should do that. We talked about things like checking your transitions, and the macro dynamics from part to part applies to this part of the arrangement just as well. Then how dense does each part need to be? Does every instrument has to play all the time? What's the voice of each part? Very important when we talk about lead parts, because sometimes it is the actual voice, sometimes it's a lead guitar melody, sometimes it can be a drum fill or a bass part or whatever, but something is the focal point typically in each part. We talked about that. We talked about variation versus repetition. Do you intentionally have two parts that are exactly the same, or do you add something new that when it comes the second time comes around, basically? We talked about that you have to be intentional. So you have to know, why do you arrange it that way? What's the goal? Of course, there's always the odd spontaneous idea, and that's art and creativity. But, in general, you can be intentional and guide the listener through the song. And we talked about that. And then we talked about things like trying things, being bold and not boring. We also said it's your record and not a copy of something that's already out there. So all these rules can also be broken if you do it intentionally and if you like the result. So go back to the last episodes where we talk a lot more about these bullet points. And now, after you've done that and you're now coming back, we can talk about lead parts and vocals.
Yeah. So this is probably, it's tricky. This might be the most important thing to get right, is the arrangement of your lead melody parts. Because often the lead line of your song, the lead melody or the top line of your song is the lead vocal. And that is how the story, the lyrics of your song get portrayed. And I think most people would agree that is the most crucial message to get across, is the vocal performance. So if we don't have this arranged correctly, this can really trash your song, and this can stop your message from reaching the audience. If you don't communicate it correctly, that nobody's going to connect to the song. They're not going to know what the song's about. They're not going to know what the emotion's meant to be. So I think getting the lead melody communicated and arranged perfectly should be your top priority.
Yes,
if
absolutely.
I had to give an
Agreed.
example that I see common in, let's say, kind of like metal, maybe metal or rock, like guitar-driven metal or rock, the main problem I would see with lead melody arrangements is that there's a great lead vocal, and then there's somebody whittling away on their guitar at the same time, like just kind of like playing lead licks that are in the same range as the vocal melody even, and just like close but not quite the same, and it's taking away from the vocal rather than adding. That's probably the most common mistake I see in lead melody arrangements. What about you, Benny? You got any like bugaboos?
I absolutely agree. So because it's the same, oftentimes the lead melodies play in the same frequency range, like you said. Then also they are oftentimes in like panned center, like they are in the middle of the stereo image, just like the lead vocals are, which creates another problem. Or it's not a problem, but it makes it difficult, even more difficult to create separation. And then sometimes there can be weird effects. I actually just had this with a coaching student of mine where I critiqued a mix, and the mix was totally fine. But the first word of the first verse, I could I knew that it was not distorted, but it absolutely sounded like the vocal was distorted, and that was because of the lead guitar melody behind the vocal that had a sort of distortion that made it sound as if the vocals were distorted. And
yes.
I swear it sounded it was the vocal, but it wasn't. As soon as you muted the guitar, turns out the vocal was perfectly fine. You know what I mean? Like the guitar had a sort of a crackly thing on top of it, and
phantom noises. Yeah,
exactly. And it absolutely sounded like it was the vocal, and so you can create all kinds of problems there.
Yeah. Little side note on these like phantom noises, as I've dubbed them. They are the worst thing to encounter as a mixer, because somebody makes a revision note, says the vocals are distorted, and you spend hours like going through all these like weird ways of trying to fix your vocal, and like you're looking for it, and you're like, I just don't hear it. Like I've had it where it's like there's a click in the vocal, and I'm like, I'm soloed it out. I'm like passing things to listen to different frequency ranges, and it just sounds normal to me. And then I realized that the attack on the bass guitar, which is also panned up center, is like just a little ahead of like the consonants of the vocal, and that's the click sound. It's stuff like that happens all the time, and it's so hard to pin down. So
100%.
Instruments kind of fuse together, especially when they're in the same frequency range and they're timed similarly.
Absolutely, yeah, totally. So this makes it very hard to, it can work, but it makes it pretty hard if you have a lead vocal melody, like a lead vocal line that is the focal point of the part, and then you have maybe a lead guitar line playing at the same time. Can absolutely work if done well, but you got to know how to do it, and you got to find not only the right tone, but also what they actually play. Is it like melody, counter melody? Is it a call and response thing? Does it play at the same time? Is it supporting the vocal, or is it getting in the way of the vocal, which shouldn't be the case ideally? So this is the question. It's not that you can't do this, but what function does it have? Like, why is it there, basically? And is it helping, or is it just getting in the way? Yeah,
exactly.
It starts with the question, what's the actual lead melody in each part? Is it the vocal, or is it the guitar? Is it a synth? Nothing at all, maybe? Is it just a riff part with no melody at all? And then, is it meant to carry sort of emotions, which means, like, how does it make you feel? Is it a sad melody? Is it a happy melody? Is it just something supporting something else? Like, why is this melody there, basically? You got to ask yourself. And then, should it be up front? Should it sit in the mix between all the other elements? It's, again, about the focal point. If it's really on top of the mix and very upfront, the listener's going to be focusing on that automatically, and everybody's going to listen to the melody first. But if it's like, you can also have melodies where they become part of the band, part of the mix more, and they are sort of embedded inside the wall of guitars, for example, and it's just a subtle thing, which is a totally different feel and vibe. So yeah, these are basically some of the questions.
Yeah. If you're looking for context, like a context example on that up front or behind, you'll find that in a lot of like hard rock or like edgy rock, the vocals often set back in the mix a little bit, so they're kind of competing with the guitars, and it just kind of makes them like sound like they're singing harder and like more in it. Where pop, it's often very on top. It's like a vocal very forward, very close to you sounding.
Yeah, absolutely. To me, when the vocal is part of the band more and not so much on top, it makes the band sound louder. So it makes sense to me in the rock context, because if the vocal is very much on top of the mix, the band kind of sounds a little weaker. And if the vocal is a little buried, it seems like the vocalist has to sort of fight the band a bit, which creates energy, and is sort of also the feeling that we all know from like small club shows and that sort of vibe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I love that sound.
Yeah, me too, totally. Okay, but now back to the lead parts again. We're not going to talk so much about vocal arrangements, by the way, I think, because we have a full episode on that, which is episode 31, which is entirely about vocal arrangements. So I think we will get back to this again and again throughout this episode probably, but it's not mainly about vocals. So the stereo image, we talked about that. Is the lead melody that you have, the synth or the guitar, is it dead center? Is it left and right? Are there enough elements to fill out left and right? Do you need to double a rhythm part so that the mix doesn't get smaller, for example, when the lead kicks in? And let me explain how I mean that. It can be, this is sometimes the case, you can have a verse with two rhythm guitars. So both guitars play chords in a verse. And then there's like a chorus or a bridge or some part that's meant to be bigger, where one of the guitars switches to a lead melody. Now, if you just do that and one guitar switches from chords to lead melody, the part can actually sound quieter and smaller because you don't have the wide rhythm anymore. And instead of just doing that, you should probably double the rhythm and put the lead to the center, or double the lead as well and have like two stereo tracks of guitars, basically. But you probably won't get away with just changing what one of the guitars is playing, because like your part is likely going to be smaller than the verse, which you don't want in this case.
Totally. Yeah. So the usual example of this situation is that one of the guitars launches into a solo, and the more modern solution to that is usually overdubbing a guitar up the middle that plays the solo. That's your lead melody now. Like the vocals have stopped, there's a guitar solo that replaces it up the center, and you keep the rhythm going on the left and the right. You don't stop one of the guitars because that guitarist is now playing the solo, because that just all of a sudden your mix goes and just kind of drops out on one side.
Unless you want to do the AC/DC thing and just stick to two guitars no matter what, and that's their style, fine.
There's a vibe, but it's pretty hard to pull off in my experience.
Yeah, especially with modern stuff. Yeah,
exactly.
We already said it. Next question would be, is there a vocal on top of the lead instrument? And how do you make sure they can coexist without getting in each other's way? We basically already covered that. And again, it's not that you can't do it. You just have to double check and be really careful. And sometimes it's enough to have a very subtle melody behind the vocal, just barely audible, and that totally does the trick. So a lead guitar behind the vocal doesn't have to be super loud. Sometimes it's enough if it's just barely audible and tucked in there, and it will absolutely work. And a lot of bands just make the mistake of wanting to hear everything super loud all the time, and that creates problems. So I often get these types of mix revisions where there is a lead guitar line in the chorus, and they want to have that louder. I can absolutely hear it. It's there. It does its job, but they want it louder, and I don't want it to compete with the vocals that are much more important in the chorus. And so this is a pretty standard thing that you just need to understand. There is ways to make it audible, but usually it's a good idea to just make it so that you can hear it, and then it's enough. It doesn't have to be in the center and in the spotlight, basicly.
Yeah, I think maybe we should talk about this a little bit, because I feel like I kind of worded it as, if you don't do it, it's not a problem, and that's the best solution.
Yeah.
But it totally can work. So some examples of how to fix it is, like, first off, my first instinct would be to try and create separation. So pan it out more. If you can make the kind of frequencies different, if it's a little sharper, it might stand out more. If it's a little duller, it might blend in more. But occasionally, you'll find that the opposite seems to be the solution, where you can kind of try and layer it like right under your lead vocal, for example, and then duck it down and really try and blend it that way. And sometimes that's just like the way it has to be. So in general, the more separation, the better for me, but not always. You got to experiment.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and sometimes it can be a call and response thing. It can be, it can work together beautifully if done well. So, but just, as always, be intentional and double check if it's really what you want or if it's getting in the way.
Well, that is really the answer, is that the part is what makes it. So if you write and arrange the part to complement the vocal, there's no problem. Wherever.
Typically. Absolutely. So then now the lead part, if it's really the lead part and not just the supporting melody in the background, is usually the most important thing. So again, it can be a vocal, can be a lead guitar or something else. So it's often a good idea to make space for it in all the other elements. So instead of compromising the lead sound and tweaking that, or tweaking the source tone, or trying to come up with something different for the lead part to make it work, maybe leave the lead part as it is if it's the most important thing, and try to change everything else so that it fits in. Sometimes that's the answer. Or oftentimes that's the answer, because the lead is, if it's the most important part, why would you compromise that? I would rather make the rhythms less busy or remove some other element that's getting in the way. That could be the answer. Sometimes it's not, but it can be.
That is like the main reason that producers are often simplifying like drum parts and bass parts and stuff. It's not because drums and bass sound better when they're simpler. It's that the vocal or the lead instrument sounds better when everything behind it is simpler.
Yeah. Totally. This is also interesting. You said it in pop music, where the vocal is so important and so loud, and it's almost like major labels, when then they approve mixes or productions, like they always want the vocals to be as loud as possible, as if they almost don't care about like what's in the background, because it sells the music, and most music listeners care about the vocals most. So I've talked to a bunch of pop mixers in the past where they would do, this is about mixing now, just a side note, but it's a similar reason. When they mix, a lot of them don't do what we do in rock typically, where we start with the drums, we get the kick drum and the snare right, and the bass and the guitars, and then the vocals sort of come last or somewhere in between, which is what a lot of rock mixers do. Many pop mixers start with the vocal and build the rest of the mix around it, because they don't want to compromise the vocal, and everything else has to make space for that, basically. And you can think about it like that in the arrangement too, when you clearly know that something is the most important part, and that's what you really want to sound as good as possible and to be upfront, then maybe write everything else around it and arrange everything else around it.
Yeah, it makes so much sense to prioritize the vocal. And I don't know why I don't try and do that in rock music. It just, everything about me wants to start with drums always.
Yeah. And I think it's good. I think it's good because, as you said, in our music, the vocal becomes part of the band, and the drive, the punch, all of that is so important in our music. So I think that there's a reason why we do it that way.
Yeah, I think so too, but I'm always curious.
Yeah, too. Maybe, we should do it, maybe. We should try it and see what comes out of it. Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay, cool. Now, the low end at the top end. It's kind of hard. This point is like, when I thought about this point, I said, like, I put in the notes here, it says, be careful with the low end at the top end. You have to be careful with the mid-range too. But and the mid-range is actually pretty hard to arrange because it's so busy. Everything's in the mid-range.
Yeah.
But I still think it's especially hard to get the low end to feel right. It's easier maybe to balance it in a way. If the mid range is really busy, it's super hard to balance that because just of the amount of elements going on. But I still think even if you just have two low end elements and you need to find the right source tones for that and write the right parts and all of that, even though you only have two elements down there, maybe it's still quite difficult to arrange it, write it, and record it so that it feels correct. And in the top end, it's similar. You only have the vocal sibilance maybe there and maybe some percussive element and maybe cymbals or whatever. But I think let's put it differently, if that is wrong for whatever reason, the whole mix just doesn't work because it's either going to be muddy or it's going to be too thin or it's going to be harsh or dull or any of these sort of things that we don't want. So I'd say clarity is important, but mud is to be avoided, but it also shouldn't sound harsh and annoying. So this is so hard to describe because everybody always says that everything's in the mid-range and it's so hard to get that part right. But I still think if you make like major mistakes in the low end or the top end, it's gonna make your song sound pretty amateur no matter what you do in the mix. If there's just no top end element at all, or if it's like super bright and harsh from the start, or if there is no real low end element, if there's no clear bass line because whatever you've written and put in your song is like lacking there, or you don't even have a bass part in a part that actually should be big or something like that. If you make major mistakes like that, it just won't sound great no matter what you do. So I don't know why, but to me, the low end and the top end, they just need to work. And they need to have what they need in order to be as big as you want it and as bright as you want it, but not harsh and not muddy.
Okay. Now, could you give us an example of relay it to an instrument or something because we're talking about lead parts here.
Okay, so there's the top end and the bottom end of the lead part, which means the mud would not be the actual low end, but like 200, 300 hertz, something like that in a guitar. So a dull guitar tone or a very harsh and bright guitar tone. But this is not true top end and low end. This would be just the upper and lower end of the lead part. Mm-hmm. But what I also mean is like the balance between what's going on in the mid range, which is typically the lead part. That is the correct way to put it, actually, versus what's going on at the top end or at the bottom end of the mix. So if you have a lead part that's the focal point and that's upfront and important in the mix, but then your low end is very weak compared to that, or your top end is super harsh or lacking compared to that, it almost doesn't matter if the lead part that's covering the mid-range is like exactly right and sounds great and works with all the rest of the mid-range. If it doesn't work in context with, or if it's not balanced well against the low end and the top end. And I'm not talking about mixing, I'm talking about the arrangement. So you can have a killer guitar solo or a very good lead part or a very cool lead vocal, and everything around it, the rhythm guitars and everything else work well. So what's directly related to it, everything works well. But if the low end of the mix, the arrangement there is lacking, if there's no bass line that has a weight to it, if there's no root notes that support the lead, or if there's no sparkling thing on the top end that's balanced against what happens in the mid-range, it almost doesn't matter how great it is because it just won't work. I always think, to me, that the low end and the top end still is very important because it helps make the lead thing sound good that is actually only in the mid-range. Does that make sense?
This brings up a really good point. Okay, so it's really easy to think you have to use the instruments you have, for example. So I love that pop music has made the 808 a thing. Like, it's so popular because that is totally, like, an 808 kick sound is a totally different instrument than a kick drum. It does a totally different job. And what we're seeing is there might be a part where it drops down to just like a 4-on-the-floor kick and a vocal or something. And if you then use an 808 kick, it's a totally different part than if you use the rock kick and you've got like the "We Will Rock You" kind of vibe going on or something. You know, like it's so different and it supports it in a different way. So what I'm saying is that you might write a lead part and that might dictate what your low-end instruments are doing, right? You might have to alter your other arrangement pieces to fit this top line. So that could mean different instruments. It could mean playing in different registers. It's actually a really fascinating point you're bringing up. Like, if you picture Mozart planning his orchestra, he wasn't just choosing an instrument. Like, he might not just choose a violin because it's a violin. He might choose it because a violin playing those notes will sound different than a trumpet playing the same notes. You know, it's totally different. So I'm really glad you brought that up, Benny. I think that's fascinating.
Totally, yeah, that's a good example too. That the same part played by a different instrument has a totally different vibe and feeling to it. Yeah, absolutely. Right.
Yeah,
cool.
Or like think about the breakdown where this classic held chords and like sustained bass notes. If you replace that with like a sine wave bass pad, it's like so different.
Yes, exactly.
Same part, totally different.
Absolutely. Now, the last thing here about lead parts that I think about is there a way to enhance it by adding additional layers to it? We know that from vocal arrangements, and as I said, we have a whole full episode on that. But you can do that same thing or similar things with other lead parts too. So does it make sense to write harmonies to that little guitar lick there or that solo or something, or parts of it? Could you do an octave below or above whatever you're playing? Can the bass line support the lead? Should it be playing like in unison, like for a couple of parts, where they do the same thing for a couple of bars? Do they play different things? Is it like a counter melody, or is it like maybe the lead plays up and the bass plays down at the same time? These things all have like different vibes to them.
Right.
There can be a tasteful like drum fill to enhance a certain part. That can be exactly the same rhythm or something else. Again, like a call and response thing or, whatever, but like intentional. Any cool, unique effects that you could try. So is there a way to enhance that lead part? And it all starts again with thinking about why it is there in the first place, how it should feel. And then maybe you can come up with something to support it and make it even better. It can be very subtle things, but oftentimes just the melody alone is not enough, and it needs a little bit extra to really do it.
Totally. Harmonies are a great thing to think about when arranging because they can either create less separation and bring something more into the mix. So if you put like a lower harmony on a vocal that gets it closer to the guitars, it might blend a little better. But you can also create separation by going the other way with it and just make it pop more. So really, really powerful technique.
Yeah, for sure. When you start to think about it like that and you analyze some of your favorite songs, how many of those small things you can discover, like how well things are sometimes arranged and we don't even notice until we intentionally listen for that. Like in some great guitar solos, it's not only the solo that's great, but it's also what's going on in all the other instruments at the same time that make certain parts of it sound really great. And there's so many like small details intentionally put in there. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Honestly, go listen to any Nickelback mix, regardless to if you hate them. The arrangements are incredible.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's pretty rare to find a vocal that doesn't have some really clever layering going on. They put a lot of work into that.
Oh yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Okay, cool. Then vocals, again, episode 31. Yes. Same thing, doubles, harmonies, octaves, gang vocals, choir, width, depth, all the same concepts basically apply. Mm-hmm. Let's go to something that we don't talk a lot about on this podcast actually, which is, let's call it post-production or additional production elements in rock music. For some bands, it's part of the actual band, but in many cases in the music that we mix, it's like additional stuff that's not part of what they do live, for example. So this can mean additional pads, synth layers, stuff you add to enhance what's been played by the band. So how do you make sure that these elements do what they're supposed to do and help the song without getting in the way of the actual band? Because sometimes that can be tricky sometimes. Like sometimes it's a very fine line. Sometimes it can be cheesy if it's too obvious. Sometimes it can be not enough, but like how do you do that? How do you, and I'm not talking mixing, but how do you choose sounds? Yeah. And how do you know if a part needs something like that? And then how do you come up with something that's not cheesy but actually helping the song and the vibe?
Yeah, it is really hard because often by the time that this step comes up, everything's full. You filled up the low end, you filled up the mids, you've taken up the subs, and your vocals or your cymbals are in the present. So it's really hard to find the spot, but you can tell that it needs something sometimes, and it's really tricky. Experience goes a long way in this category, in my opinion. I've got kind of two people, really, maybe three, that I call on if I'm I know that I really need some killer post-production and synths on, and I might just hire them to do it because they seem to find those better than I ever could.
Yeah.
It's a pretty unique skill set. The other solution is to start considering it sooner. Getting it in, if you're treating it as an afterthought, probably will be an afterthought. And how we mentioned earlier, what you create might dictate what everything else does. And by the time you bring synths in, which is after you've already recorded everything, you can't change anything. You're kind of locked in by that point. So just bringing in synths into your arrangement and writing process will help you with this a lot.
Yeah, I totally think so, that they should be, if at all possible, you should consider them from the beginning, or at least when you start doing pre-pro and not in the final recording session. Yeah. I think sometimes though, and this goes back to the original question that we got from Jesse here, where he asks about how to create tones that play well together. Sometimes what the band recorded is cool, but you can definitely hear that it's maybe some part is not full. Like most of the parts are full, as you said. Like usually the arrangements are refined and work. But sometimes there's a part where the tones are just lacking a little bit, and it's not just the tones, but like what is being played. So this could mean that the bass is playing up an octave for some reason, and the weight is lacking. And but the part should be big. So in this case, you can just fill that in and create a tone that works, that enhances the actual bass sound, and you can put a sine wave below the bass or some synth bass that does that. Sometimes the guitars just sound a little too not exciting enough. I don't know how to say that. They could use some teeth, some grit, some additional like distortion, whatever. And then you want to put maybe some distorted synth chords behind the guitars to give them a little extra beef or something. Sometimes. Right. Sometimes you could spot holes in the frequency spectrum where there is, I don't know, it sounds a little too scooped in the mid-range, but like giving the guitars more mid-range doesn't work and it sounds cardboardy, so you need something else. And maybe you can find some sort of synth sound that can fill that in a little bit and without having to change the guitar tone, These types of things where you have the finished thing, something's lacking, EQ doesn't do it, mixing tricks don't do it, so you have to maybe add something to the arrangement to make it work.
Yeah.
Or it's basically the same concept as adding one-shot drum samples to a drum kit that actually sounds great. Sometimes at the end of it, you just need a little extra because it sounds great, but you need a little bit, whatever, a little more punch, a little more some type of room sound or something. And instead of trying to get that out of the actual drums, you can just blend a little bit of an extra drum sample and that will do it. And you can do a similar thing with additional synth layers to give the guitars what they're lacking or add to the bass, stuff like that.
When you're sculpting these sounds, again, go back to do we need more separation or do we actually need less separation? Do we need to blend it? And that, I think people make that mistake, particularly with like subsynths a lot, where they're like, all right, we're going to make it only low end. And then it's just like, there's no way to attach it to anything else in the mix. So you actually I end up distorting the heck out of them to get some like upper harmonics into it so that I can blend it in with like our drums and guitars a little bit. So sometimes you have to really experiment with the sound to make that part work.
I love the concept of do we need more or less separation? And I think this is something that might be hard to tell especially if you're a beginner. Like if it has enough glue, if it's too like what I remember, I'm thinking that because I remember sending a mix of mine. It was I think in 2011, 10, something like that, like a long time ago. I sent the mix to someone to master it, and I thought it sounded good and worked. And the feedback that I got was not what I expected because the mastering engineer said it's a very like clean mix that's well balanced and well done. But my problem is it might be too like clean. There might be too much separation. It's like very hard to make it feel like a band. And I didn't know what to do with that info. I didn't know there was such a thing as like too much separation. And because I always thought that's basically the goal. I want to hear everything. I want to carve out space for everything. And that's what I was after at the time. And I didn't really know what to do with that info and how to tell if something needs less separation maybe.
Yeah.
So
glue it together.
Yeah. So how do you know if that's the case? Because I know that most people are stoked to get like to get as much separation as possible, and they are stoked if they can pull off a mix that where you can hear everything clearly, and that is sort of the goal for many people, especially in the beginning. And how do you tell if you maybe took it too far and you need to add something or you need to bring it together more?
Well, I think when it's arranging, that's less of a concern because the part just won't feel like it's working.
Yeah,
You'll just be like, okay, like it just sounds like this, like especially with pads, they're constant and they're usually like not dynamic, right? They're just like a pad. And if it's not gelling, it just sounds like somebody's playing a weird note over your song constantly kind of thing. So
you're right.
I think it's a little bit more obvious. It's in mixing, that conversation comes up a little bit more like, okay, how much do I carve out to like make it sit back and seem like its own thing? It is a hard thing to answer. I don't know if there's like a way around that without experience.
Yeah, Probably not. Yeah, you're right. But you're right. In the arrangement, it's easier because it will just not work. You just have to think about it like a music fan or a musician and not so much about a mixer in this case. So does it work? Does it feel right or not?
Yeah, I might have a way for people to identify if it's a sonic thing.
Okay.
Maybe. Let's try it. So there's like two examples I can think of that are extremely rewarding for how things sound together. A big held, powerful, distorted, like JCM 800 rock guitar chord, like a big open E or something, or like a big like drop D kind of like metal thing, and your drummer freaking smashes like the china and the crash and a kick drum at the same time. That sounds like one instrument, right?
Yeah.
Now, palm mute guitar, distorted, kind of same thing, but palm muted, boom, and the drummer hits the floor tom and kick. Boom.
Yeah.
Like that is like the two examples of like, these are a perfect match. This feels good every time we do it. Now, how do you make that happen with your synth part? Like, how do you make that same effect happen? Or whatever instrument. We're trying to make them all feel like they belong together if you're looking for a more glued experience. So if you can identify like examples of like, oh yeah, this works. This is a combination that fits together. It might help you then analyze like, oh, this isn't working. What is that?
Yeah, absolutely. That totally helps. You're right. Absolutely. The only thing is you need to know is that sometimes it's the arrangement. It's an arrangement thing. Sometimes with post-production, to me at least, the idea might be good and it might need this element and it could sound like one, but maybe it doesn't because you've chosen a very cheesy sound or tone. This can happen easily with synth that just doesn't really blend well. So the idea is great, but it doesn't blend well because of the sound you've chosen. And in that case, I think, yeah, you just hire someone who knows what they're doing, or you send the MIDI to your mixer to like, here's the idea, but maybe you can do a better thing. Because sometimes it sounds like my first Casio keyboard or something, where it's like instead of like a good, well-programmed post-production thing, and this can happen easily, and it happened to me too, where I thought I had a great idea and I programmed it and it sounded very amateur, just because of the sound or whatever I chose, so.
Totally.
Yeah, but you're right. You're right. If it's right, it's just right, and it becomes one. And those examples with the drums and they really are good. Cool.
I think we're on to our closing thoughts here.
Yeah, I think so, because everything else has been said. It's like you can, of course, like adding anything post-pro can make things better or can make it sound more muddy and cluttered if you overdo it. Like we have already said everything about this basically. So yeah, let's go to the closing thoughts here to wrap it up. Basically, again, from two perspectives. The one is the frequency content and the other one is like, what do the parts actually play and how do they work together? Like the actual parts that you're playing. So when it comes to frequency, how, like, is the foundation big enough, but not muddy? Like, do you have enough weight and low end and not mixing, but like enough actual instruments playing low-end parts, and how do they work together? Is there a low-end that works, that makes you move, that makes you feel the song, because that's what low-end does mainly? Or does it sound thin? It's not like moving you. It sounds small, doesn't have the weight. Don't think you should address that in the mix. Like it should somehow, like at least to some degree, work with just the arrangement. If there's nothing there, add something. If it's too muddy, reduce something or make it work. So how tight, how defined, or how big, how round do you want the low end to be? Again, drum tuning comes into play. Where on the bass do you play the parts? All these things that we talked about in the last episode. So the low end, big part of it.
Yeah, I think I just want to drive home that you said it's not mixing. It's like, is there actually an instrument filling that hole? Like filling that spot in the mix. That's really what to consider there. Not how does that bass guitar sound, just is there a bass guitar or a bass instrument filling that spot?
Yeah. And is it playing low enough, or is it playing not low enough? Is it, as any of these things, is it clashing with something else down there? I don't know. Like, is there something? And also, what is it playing? And what are other things playing in sort of the same part of the frequency spectrum? And if they do the same thing, is that intentional and they become one? Or do you actually want separation? And in that case, one of them has to play something different,
Totally, yeah. And so this closing thoughts, by the way, is recapping both episodes. So again, that first episode, totally mandatory listening here. But like more than just like frequency and parts is rhythmically, every instrument is a rhythm instrument, ultimately. They're all contributing to the rhythm and groove of the song. So you need to make sure, okay, what is the groove of the song? Does it have a groove? Does it have a feel? And is everything contributing to that, or is something taken away on its own, or is there multiple kind of vibes that go and work together? Like that can happen, but ultimately, is the groove there? Has that been arranged between all of the instruments?
Sure, exactly. Then there's like the main groove things like strumming patterns and what the bass and the kick drum does and stuff like that. The obvious stuff, but sometimes it's like micro timing elements where it could be that the hi-hat pattern clashes or is like sounding confusing together with the strumming pattern of the guitars, where the guitars might do the right thing, kick and snare do the right thing, it's all good, but maybe the hi-hats are, the way the hi-hats sound or the pattern of the hi-hats sounds weird with the acoustic guitar strumming that's also up there, sometimes that can be the case, or a shaker or a tambourine or something. Some micro timing element in the top end that causes a problem. Sometimes we don't listen to these things, we focus on the kick, snare, and riff, and it all seems good. But there might be something that's a little odd. It might cause the part to feel late or early or, can happen.
Absolutely. Definitely happen.
Cool. Then frequency spectrum. Sorry, Malcolm, go ahead. Yeah.
No, that's where I was heading to is
go ahead.
like, is there a balanced mix essentially created by the instrumentation that's been arranged and the parts that have been arranged? If everybody's playing as low as possible, you're going to kind of be wondering what's going on the top end of your frequency spectrum because nobody's filling that spot. Enter cymbals, So consider that. I mean, unless that's your goal is to just to have something that doesn't fill one of those spots. Because, I mean, you know what? That can totally work. Reduction can be a really explosive dynamic, right? To leave something intentionally absent so that it can come back later can be a very cool thing.
Yeah, totally. Or the entire aesthetic is sort of a lo-fi thing where you absolutely don't want a lot of subs and a shiny top end, and it's all about the mid-range. Can be a thing, and it just has to be intentional.
Absolutely.
If you expect the polished modern pop punk mix, you probably want pretty bright, shiny cymbals. But if you do, some lo-fi, indie, whatever thing where it can be pretty dark, then you might not need anything above 10K. Or, it depends on what you're doing. So, but just know what the aesthetic is you're going for, and then double check if you have everything you need. Do you have the foundation? Do you have the clarity? Do you have the mid-range articulation? Do you have the top-end sheen if you want it? And all of those things. Then, are there chords, a bass line, and background melody, or melodic rhythm elements, harmonies, lead vocals, and pads? What I mean is what's the musical information? Like, do you have a bass line, a clearly defined bass line, the root notes? Do you have chords, like the classic, chord progression? Which instrument is playing that? Is there a lead melody that's important? Are there harmonies to that lead melody? Do you need a background melody? Do you need a counter melody, something like that? Do you need some pads because there is to fill in the gaps, to glue it together because you don't have any sustained elements? So all these typical elements of a mix, do you need all of those? You might not, but do you need all of those? And if you do you have them? Or is one of them completely lacking, but you could actually use them? So just these basic musical elements, right?
Yeah, this is an interesting thought. If each person in the band plays their part on their own, can you tell what song it is? Mm-hmm. That's going to be a pretty good clue that they're playing something that's, relevant and connected to the song. If the singer just hums their melody, can you tell what song it is instantly? If the guitar player plays the riff, does it sound like the song without everybody else?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good idea, actually. That's really cool. A cool idea to try, for sure. All right. Now, and then which element does what? Do you even need everything? Is it cluttered? We already said that. And then are the vocal layers helping the message? Because ultimately the vocal is about the emotional content, the lyrics, like what's the song about? In most cases, that matters, right? And so if you add anything to those vocals, is it helping the message? Is it helping how the vocals are supposed to feel? Does it make a bigger part bigger? Does it make a sad part even more sad? Is it adding to the emotion that's part of the song? And are the important vocal parts really coming through and big enough and clear enough, close enough, intimate enough, intelligible? Sometimes you think something sounds great and bigger with a lot of layers, but if the intelligibility suffers because of that and you can't really make out the lyrics anymore, is that actually better then? Or is there a sort of, what's the trade-off and what's the right balance there? Sometimes it's better to have it very close and intimate and clearly audible what the lyrics are without any layers, So always be intentional and think about what the song is about. If it's a very intimate love song and a ballad or whatever, you might just want one vocal right in your ear compared to a big stadium rock chorus, with like totally different.
Yeah, totally. And like vocal doubling, like it just sounds bigger once you layer vocals. But is that actually good? It can be like easy to be like, yes, that is sonically rewarding. We're going to leave that on the whole time. But like now there's no lift for the chorus, for example, or it doesn't get smaller when you need it to. Like it might not be the move. Just because it sounds better without context doesn't mean it sounds better in context.
100%. That's actually a very good sentence to wrap up this episode, to end this episode, because it's all about context when it's arranging, right? And arrangement, per definition, has to be at least like two elements that can be arranged. It's not about one thing. So it's about context. Doesn't matter what things sound like on their own.
Yeah.
And you said last time there was some cool puzzle analogy. I think I can't remember what you said, but there was something you said after having your third coffee, which was very smart. So if you go back to
I'm only
that
on coffee
episode,
2 here, so that's my problem, I think.
whatever the puzzle analogy was, that one was good. And it's all about these puzzle pieces and how they work together. And so thank you for listening.
Making sure you have all the puzzle pieces and that they all fit. They're from the same puzzle. That would help too.
Yeah, it was
It's
something
amazing
along
that I
those
can't
lines.
remember this analogy. I loved it at the time. But
Yeah, it was good. It was good. Just go back to that episode if you haven't yet, and then you'll hear that.
totally.
All right. Thank you again for this amazing question, Jesse. And thank you for listening. And if you have any additional questions, follow-up questions, if anything is still unclear, just let us know. Send us a message or post in the community, and we're happy to give us our thoughts. Not your
Definitely,
thoughts,
yeah.
our thoughts.
Both these episodes came from a question being posted in the community, or was that just direct?
In the community.
Yeah. So
it was in the community.
that's the value of this thing. So head over to the Self-Recording Band Facebook community.
Exactly. All right. Talk to you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.